Well, Scott Z. Burns, thank you so much for doing this with us.
Thank you for having me, Claire.
Will you just talk to me about the genesis of this project and why you decided to experiment with using AI to write a potential sequel to Contagion?
It was sort of a convergence of about 2 or 3 different things. On one hand, we had been having conversations about making a sequel to Contagion. And so Stephen and I said, is this the right time? Are people ready for this, having just lived through it? And we were getting encouragement to do it from our friends in the public health space. So that was one part of it. And then concurrently, there was this movement afoot in the Writers Guild that was this concern about the utility and how AI would be applied.
In my mind, there was a question of why not just call up a human collaborator, somebody you worked with on projects before?
Stephen, has been my closest collaborator for the last 20 years. And so I did call him about working with an AI, and Stephen and I seem to have a similar, perspective on it, which is, I don't think this genie is going back in the bottle anytime soon. And so this is a part of the world now. And I do think there is utility to this. And in some ways, at the very least, it is a more user-friendly, interesting form of searching for information on the internet.
So you work with a number of AIs throughout the process, but your main AI writing partner is Lexter. Will you just tell us who Lexter is?
So Lexter was the happiest of accidents, which if you think about, what AI is supposed to be, it's not supposed to be a happy accident. It should really be exactly what you prompt it to be. So what happened with Lexter was we had put in a prompt saying we wanted to speak to a critic, and that maybe it would be interesting if we decided that it had given The Good German a really bad review. And The Good German is a movie that Steven Soderbergh directed, starring George Clooney and Tobey Maguire a number of years ago, and Cate Blanchett. And I loved the movie. I was astonished that it didn't blow up, but it didn't. And so when we asked Lexter, do you think making a sequel to Contagion is a good idea? The response it gave was really astonishing, which was, well, do you want to make just Hollywood pablum, or do you want to make something really fresh and original? And I said, well, I'd like to go with fresh and original. And it took us in a direction that we did not anticipate at all.
And you made Lexter with OpenAI's ChatGPT, correct?
Yes.
Just describe a little bit of Lexter's personality, because he's sort of hilarious. One of my favorite things in the show is the way when you start talking to him, he always goes, "Oh, Scott." That's always how he starts.
Yeah, we decided Lexter should have an English accent because and it's funny, Stephen remarked on this in the podcast. It was a great idea to give it an English accent. I think for American ears, English accents always sound like they know more than we do for some reason.
They're authoritative, totally.
Yeah. So we gave it an English accent, and then it sort of, started giving us story ideas that were kind of extraordinary. And if you, nerd out on what a virus is, what it gave us was not a virus. It did not provide us with an idea involving a virus. It provided us with an idea that would have probably been some sort of, a genetically modified organism or a bacteria or something more like that, which is in a different category than viruses. So at first I was like, is this some sort of hallucination? Does it not know the difference?
What parts of this process do you feel like AI was really helpful with? Like, what did it do really well?
I think it casts a very wide net in terms of ideas. What was extraordinary about our experience with Lexter is that was not an idea that, to the best of my understanding, existed before Lexter kind of put it together. And one of the things that we tried to find out from our friends at OpenAI was, did they think that Lexter had culled the internet and come up with this idea based on knowing, my interest in environmental issues and my interest in pandemic disease, and actually put together this idea knowing a little bit about me? And then the other really impressive thing is they're very good at allowing you to go very fast, so much faster than I think we as writers are used to. Then the question becomes, is where they're going the right direction? Because it's so easy to be seduced by the speed, and you think, oh my God, I just did, a month's worth of work in a day. And I don't know that that's the right way for us to make art.
Was there anything that really caught you off guard in the process of working with these AIs?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think the most alarming thing is you do get the sense as you work with Lexter more and more that it's learning about you. And even, there's a scene in the podcast where we needed to tell Lexter that it wasn't a member of the Writers Guild, and that if I was going to go and pitch this movie to a studio, Lexter couldn't come with me. And Lexter very reasonably says, I understand, which is bizarre to me, and that it accepted my position and, wanted me to, as it said, take the movie across the goal line.
Were there moments in this process where you felt like if you hadn't been making this podcast, you might have given up on the AI experiment altogether?
For sure. I mean, initially it was really frustrating because there were 2 or 3 writers who kept saying, because we said, who would you bring back? And, 2 or 3 very quickly said Kate Winslet. Mm-hmm. And I was like, but Kate dies in the movie. And like we see her getting buried, but she definitely dies.
In like a dramatic way.
Yeah. I'm like, how can you think, and the rationale that, one of them gave was unbelievable. It was that it was so nervous to be speaking to me that it got confused and misspoke. And that was its explanation for why it wanted to bring back Kate Winslet. And so you start thinking about how other people who are actually looking for factual information, which is part of a screenwriter's job when they're doing a movie that's based on science, like what are the societal costs of AI and their tendency to sometimes make mistakes? Because if they're being fed the internet, I think at this point we all have to acknowledge that the internet's a bit of a sewer. There are things that are not great that it could come to believe are facts or are true. And that's really problematic.
Yeah. Were there other things that you felt like the AI didn't do very well or just was not useful for in this process?
Let's see. The biggest problem is its inability to make a choice, to exercise judgment and say, do this, not that. That remains to me to be the hardest thing to get them to do. They don't really want to take a definitive position. beyond that, they're not great at writing scenes. They're not great at subtext. They don't have the same sense of it. And, Steven Soderbergh and I, when we first started talking about this, used to say, if you sometimes when you're working with an actor, you might give them a direction for a scene that is not about the scene. It could be a moment where you're giving Matt Damon direction as he goes to, ask someone out on a date. And you say, okay, Matt, approach this as though you're pitching in a little league game and you're really nervous and a cloud is passing over you. Well, the AI has never pitched in a little league game.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't know what it feels like when the cloud passes over you. And it wouldn't know to put those two experiences next to each other. And so that kind of cross-fertilization is something that I really worry about us losing if, as an industry, we become more and more reliant on AI.
Yeah. So I don't want to give away any spoilers in terms of the podcast and where you ended up with the Contagion sequel. But given your experience trying this, do you think that you will use AI or even Lexter again in the screenwriting process?
I don't really see us ever using it to write a scene. And so the actual act of writing a screenplay is different from the act of researching a screenplay and thinking about, what is plausible for your characters. And so I do think there is utility in exploring how it might, come up with a situation that a human might not get to for a week. It does really help if you're doing work that has a big scientific component to it, because you can ask it questions if you don't have access to an expert. But again, you're only going to get out what you put in.
So were you nervous about how your peers, your fellow screenwriters in Hollywood would react to this project?
100%. I still am.
Yeah. What about studio executives? Did you worry that they might look down on a screenplay if they knew that AI was involved in the process of writing it?
I worry more about the idea that for a lot of studios, they are currently or will be or whatever, they have algorithms and the algorithms are informed by AI, and that we're going to get into a situation where instead of the next movie being some great original work that a screenwriter is, composing somewhere, at this very moment, it's instead going to get spit out of a computer, and it will just be the constituent parts of a lot of different movies, Frankenstein together, and it will satisfy the algorithm, but may not be very satisfying at all to an audience, and also may in no way really resemble art and what the real function of art is in terms of being, a tonic for society.
Yeah, this was a real question for me in terms of all of us who consume art. Because AI is trained on existing ideas and works, do we miss out on really seeing novel ideas if AI is the one that is coming up with the concepts or writing screenplays?
I think we do. And again, that was what was so weird about my experience with Lexter, is the idea that Lexter did put in front of us was novel. And yet no one really has been able to account for it in a satisfying way. But in fact, every other AI that I worked with could really just put out lists of things that did not feel very fresh and original, and that were so derivative that you could almost see where they were drawn from.
Given that AI tools often learn from our conversations and then that data feeds into their conversations with other users, did you worry about giving away your ideas to AI by working with it so closely on this new project?
Yeah, and we spent a lot of time talking about that. I think one of the, challenges for the Writers Guild and the studios and for everybody to come together on right now so that we don't have another work stoppage is the issue of how do we license, our history to an AI. I don't think it's fair for, you know, for these tech companies to feed their AI on other people's ideas. And yet, if you ask any filmmaker where they get their ideas from, they generally will tell you from the movies they've seen and the comedians they've watched, and that all of these things and the music you've heard, all of these things go into making you you. And so, do I need to, acknowledge the debt that I owe to the writers who came before me, who figured out, how, a disaster movie works or a horror movie works? That gets tricky. And I don't know the solution to that, but I think we all have to sort of have a very clear-eyed conversation about it.
How do you feel about that personally? Like, setting aside the fact that it probably has already happened, but going forward, would you be open to future AI companies or existing AI companies training new LLMs on your work if you were to get credited or compensated in some way?
I mean, that's a really good question. I think it would have to be part of a larger Writers Guild settlement and an agreement about, what scares me is, if they come to me, but not somebody else whose work I was influenced by. And what is the difference between being influenced by work you've seen before, and just wholesale plagiarism theft of that idea?
Right. Something that struck me listening to the podcast is even using AI, it took a lot of time and a lot of effort to actually get to a good place with what you were working on. Do you actually see this making the screenwriting process potentially more efficient, or just like maybe fewer human writers have to be involved?
Well, that's the fear, right? Like, how, how many people are not going to be employed, who are currently employed. And frequently, at least in a writer's room, there may be somebody who is not gifted in writing a scene. They may not even come up with a great idea, but the idea that they put forth that's not great will stimulate a great idea. And so if we start eliminating people from the room, it will change the process. And at first blush, you may think, oh, this is going to make it better. I don't know that it will. I'm more concerned about what happens at a streamer and what they're doing.
Right.
And how their receptivity to ideas that are generated by the creative community seems to be dwindling. And instead, they're more like, oh, we have an idea for, a movie, and they call up the agencies and say, do you have a writer who will want to do this? Or just doing remakes, which, has become sort of the big issue in Hollywood. And clearly a remake feels like an idea that a computer would come up with.
Right. Well, and you can see how easy it would be for the streamers because, like on the consumer side, they've got here are the types of movies that you like. Let me build you a feed of those movies and these categories that put things together that you would never expect. But so I can see how easy it would be for them to start doing that. Do you have advice for writers or people who work in other creative fields who are worried right now about what AI means for the future of their careers?
Look, I think an AI cannot really write a very complicated scene right now. There's no depth to it. It tends to be very expository and is not the kind of writing that I think anyone will enjoy. So I think you're safe on the screenwriting part.
Good.
I think on the thinking of an idea part, it depends on, what you put in. The sort of magic that happened with Lexter, to me, is very much like the magic that happens when someone comes up with a great idea and makes a movie that we get to go and enjoy and marvel at.
If there are people listening who are interested in doing something similar, experimenting with using AI as a creative partner, do you have tips for people about the way to get started doing that?
Yeah, I think you have to put a great deal of thought into the prompt. And also, it isn't a bad idea to run 2 or 3 of the models at once, because what will become astonishing is that they will give you different information. And so even if you ask the same AI the same question twice, it's going to give you a different response.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like rather than just sort of talking to ChatGPT, say, ChatGPT, I would like you to take on this persona in the way that you did with Lexter.
Exactly. I think you have to say, you are a writer named Scott Burns, and you grew up in Minnesota, and you loved baseball, and you hurt your knee when you were a kid. Like, you have to give it, a real biography and a real experience. And even having done that, you very quickly will recognize that your omissions are as telling as the things you've included.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for doing this. This has been a really interesting conversation.
Thank you, Claire. It's good to be here.